The Federal Bureau of Investigation has seized ballots from Georgia election facilities, triggering an immediate and intense political crisis that has divided officials and observers along sharp partisan lines. The operation, conducted under federal investigative authority, has sparked accusations of political retaliation and raised fundamental questions about the independence of law enforcement agencies in an increasingly polarized environment. Critics have characterized the seizure as an unprecedented escalation, while supporters argue it represents a lawful exercise of federal oversight over election integrity matters. The action has reignited debates over the proper boundaries between state and federal jurisdiction in election administration and whether investigative actions can be conducted without the appearance of political motivation. As Georgia remains a focal point in ongoing national conversations about election legitimacy and security, this development has intensified scrutiny on both the Justice Department and the motivations behind federal intervention in state election processes. Federal agents executed the ballot seizure operation at election facilities in Georgia, removing materials under authority they identified as part of an ongoing federal investigation. The operation involved coordination with local officials, though the specific legal instruments cited for the seizure have been the subject of interpretation and debate. Federal authorities justified their actions by pointing to investigative powers granted under statutes governing election-related matters and the preservation of evidence potentially relevant to federal inquiries. State officials in Georgia issued statements acknowledging the federal operation while expressing varying degrees of concern about the scope and timing of the action. Some state authorities emphasized their cooperation with federal investigators and characterized the seizure as part of routine investigative processes. Others raised questions about whether proper protocols had been followed and whether state sovereignty over election administration had been adequately respected during the operation. The FBI released limited public comment, citing the ongoing nature of the investigation as grounds for withholding detailed information about the specific rationale, scope, and objectives of the ballot seizure. Federal officials indicated that the action was taken in accordance with established procedures and legal authority, while declining to provide specifics about what investigative questions the seized materials might answer. The divergence in official statements from federal and state levels immediately highlighted tensions over jurisdiction and authority. While some officials portrayed the seizure as a necessary step in ensuring accountability and transparency, others suggested it represented federal overreach into matters traditionally governed at the state level, setting the stage for broader political and legal confrontations. Georgia has occupied a central position in national election discussions due to its status as a competitive battleground state where margins have been narrow and outcomes have carried significant political weight. The state has been the focus of multiple controversies surrounding election administration, vote counting procedures, and allegations of irregularities that have been contested by various parties with differing interpretations of events and evidence. Previous investigations into Georgia election processes have examined questions ranging from ballot handling protocols to the security of voting systems and the accuracy of result certification. These inquiries have involved both state and federal authorities at different times, creating a complex landscape of overlapping jurisdictions and competing narratives about election integrity. Ballots themselves retain legal significance well beyond Election Day, because they serve as primary evidence in any investigation or legal challenge concerning election outcomes. Physical ballot materials can be subject to examination, recount, or forensic analysis, making their chain of custody and preservation a matter of legal importance. The continued relevance of these materials means they remain under various forms of legal protection and oversight. Existing investigations have created an environment where election materials from Georgia carry heightened scrutiny and potential evidentiary value. The persistence of unresolved questions and ongoing legal processes means that ballot seizures intersect with broader debates about accountability, transparency, and the proper methods for resolving disputes over election administration. The retaliation allegations have emerged primarily from officials and commentators who view the ballot seizure as politically motivated rather than a legitimate exercise of investigative authority. These critics assert that the timing and nature of the federal action suggest it is designed to intimidate or punish individuals and institutions in Georgia who have been involved in election-related disputes or who have challenged certain narratives about election integrity. Those making these accusations point to the broader political context as evidence for their interpretation. They argue that the seizure cannot be understood in isolation, but must be viewed against the background of ongoing tensions between federal authorities and state officials who have taken positions on contested election matters. The accusers contend that the operation represents an attempt to leverage federal law enforcement power for partisan purposes, effectively weaponizing investigative mechanisms to achieve political objectives. The stated reasoning behind these allegations centers on questions of proportionality and necessity. Critics argue that less intrusive investigative methods could have been employed and that the decision to seize ballots directly reflects motivations beyond standard law enforcement practices. They suggest that the action serves to create a chilling effect on officials who might otherwise challenge federal positions or defend state prerogatives in election administration. However, the evidence presented for these retaliation claims largely consists of circumstantial observations about timing, political alignments, and perceived patterns rather than direct documentation of improper motive. This has created a situation where interpretation depends heavily on prior assumptions about institutional credibility and the legitimacy of federal authority in election matters. Federal authority over election materials derives from constitutional provisions and statutory frameworks that grant the federal government jurisdiction over certain aspects of election administration, particularly where federal offices are concerned or where questions of civil rights and voting access arise. The legal foundation for such authority has been established through decades of legislation and judicial interpretation, creating a complex intersection between federal oversight powers and traditional state control over election mechanics. Historical precedent for ballot seizures exists, though such actions have been relatively rare and typically associated with investigations into alleged fraud, manipulation, or systemic irregularities that could affect election outcomes. Past instances have generally occurred in contexts where evidence suggested potential violations of federal law and where the preservation of ballot materials was deemed essential to investigative integrity. These precedents establish that federal agencies possess the legal capacity to intervene in state election processes under specific circumstances, though the boundaries of that authority remain subject to interpretation and judicial review. The legal boundaries governing such investigations require federal authorities to demonstrate legitimate investigative purpose and to operate within constitutional constraints that protect state sovereignty and individual rights. Courts have historically required that federal actions be proportionate to the investigative need and that they not unduly interfere with state functions absent compelling federal interest. This framework creates tension between the theoretical scope of federal power and the practical limitations imposed by principles of federalism and separation of powers. Political reactions to the ballot seizure have revealed the deep partisan divisions that characterize contemporary debates over election integrity and federal law enforcement authority. Officials and commentators aligned with one perspective have defended the FBI action as a necessary and lawful step to investigate potential irregularities and ensure accountability in election processes. They argue that federal intervention is justified when state-level oversight may be insufficient or compromised, and that protecting the integrity of democratic institutions requires independent federal scrutiny, regardless of political sensitivities. Conversely, officials from the opposing perspective have condemned the seizure as an abuse of federal power and an attack on state sovereignty in election administration. These critics characterize the action as part of a broader pattern of federal overreach designed to centralize control over election processes and marginalize state officials who maintain different views on election security and legitimacy. They contend that the seizure represents an escalation in the politicization of law enforcement agencies. The statements from key officials reflect these fundamental disagreements, with interpretations of the same event diverging sharply based on prior political commitments and institutional loyalties. Some officials have called for transparency and full disclosure of the investigative basis for the seizure, while others have demanded immediate return of the materials and challenges to federal authority through legal channels. This development fits within broader political narratives about institutional trust, the weaponization of government agencies, and the ongoing struggle over election legitimacy. Each side views the ballot seizure through frameworks that confirm existing concerns about threats to democratic processes, whether those threats are understood as fraud and irregularities or as authoritarian federal intervention. The ballot seizure places significant strain on the FBI's credibility at a moment when the Bureau faces heightened scrutiny over its role in politically sensitive investigations. The agency must navigate accusations that it operates as a partisan instrument while maintaining its position as an independent law enforcement body committed to objective fact-finding. Each action in high-profile cases becomes subject to interpretation through competing narratives about institutional capture and political bias, making it increasingly difficult for the FBI to conduct investigations without facing allegations of improper motivation, regardless of the actual merits of its work. Justice Department independence has emerged as a central concern, with questions arising about whether investigative decisions reflect genuine legal and evidentiary considerations or whether they are influenced by political pressures and partisan objectives. The department's ability to maintain public confidence depends on demonstrating that its actions follow established procedures and legal standards rather than external political direction. Yet the perception of independence can be undermined even when proper protocols are followed if timing and context suggest alternative explanations. State versus federal tensions have intensified as the seizure highlights fundamental disagreements about the appropriate distribution of authority over election administration. State officials view federal intervention as an encroachment on constitutionally protected state functions, while federal authorities assert their responsibility to ensure compliance with national standards and federal law. This jurisdictional conflict reflects broader anxieties about centralization of power and the erosion of federalist principles. The cumulative effect is a further deterioration of institutional trust across partisan lines, with each side increasingly skeptical of institutions controlled or influenced by political opponents. The ballot seizure creates significant implications for existing election-related investigations by potentially altering the evidentiary landscape and the strategic calculations of various investigative bodies. Federal authorities now possess direct access to physical ballot materials that may have been previously subject to state custody and oversight, potentially enabling new lines of inquiry or verification that were not previously available through cooperative information sharing arrangements. This development may accelerate certain investigative timelines while simultaneously complicating others, particularly if disputes arise over the proper handling and analysis of the seized materials. Potential legal proceedings could be affected in multiple ways, as the seizure may provide foundation for future charges or legal actions, while also creating new grounds for litigation concerning the propriety of the federal intervention itself. Defense strategies in any subsequent proceedings will likely incorporate challenges to the seizure's legal basis and the chain of custody for evidence derived from these materials. Coordination between state and federal investigative bodies faces increased complexity following this action. The seizure may be interpreted by some state authorities as a signal of federal distrust in state-level investigative processes, potentially reducing willingness to cooperate voluntarily in future matters. Alternatively, it may establish new protocols for federal-state collaboration in election investigations, though the contentious nature of this particular seizure suggests that any such coordination framework will remain contested and fragile. Several realistic pathways emerge from this situation, each carrying distinct implications for the future of election administration and federal-state relations. Legal challenges represent the most immediate possibility, with state officials or affected parties potentially filing motions to contest the seizure's legal foundation, demand return of the materials, or seek judicial clarification of the boundaries of federal investigative authority in state election matters. Such litigation could establish important precedents regarding the scope of federal power and the protections afforded to state election processes, though resolution through the courts may require extended timeframes that leave fundamental questions unresolved during critical political periods. Political escalation remains a significant possibility if the seizure prompts retaliatory actions or defensive measures by state authorities seeking to protect their jurisdiction and autonomy. This could manifest through legislative efforts to restrict federal access to state election materials, non-cooperation with federal investigators, or escalated rhetoric that further polarizes public opinion on questions of election integrity and institutional legitimacy. The escalation pathway carries risks of deepening the already substantial divisions over election administration and potentially creating confrontations between state and federal authorities that lack clear constitutional resolution mechanisms. Different outcomes could fundamentally reshape election integrity debates depending on what the seized ballots reveal and how various actors interpret those findings. If federal investigation produces evidence supporting claims of irregularities, it may strengthen arguments for enhanced federal oversight and standardization of election processes. Conversely, if the investigation fails to substantiate concerns, or if the seizure itself becomes the primary controversy, it may reinforce skepticism about federal involvement in state elections and energize movements toward decentralized election administration with minimal federal intervention. The ballot seizure carries profound significance for democratic institutions because it tests the resilience of systems designed to balance competing demands for accountability, transparency, and procedural integrity. The episode raises fundamental rule of law questions about whether investigative actions can be conducted in ways that maintain legitimacy across partisan divides, or whether the current political environment renders such neutrality impossible, regardless of actual adherence to legal standards. The lasting impact on election administration trust will likely depend less on the technical legality of the seizure itself and more on whether the action and its aftermath reinforce or challenge existing narratives about institutional capture and political weaponization. What remains clear is that episodes like this contribute to an environment where faith in democratic processes becomes increasingly contingent on partisan identity rather than shared confidence in institutional safeguards, creating vulnerabilities that extend well beyond any single investigation or controversy.